So we often talk about the NHS as if it's a kind of unofficial state religion, but there are many other values, especially in the kind of woke era, that are really getting the same kind of religious devotion. One of those in particular is diversity. So we're living at a time when the NHS has record high waiting lists, and yet at the same time, it's forking out a hell of a lot of money on diversity managers, some of whom will earn around 75 grand a year. I mean, this is pretty strange, possibly even quite shocking. Tom, what have you made of it?
It's really interesting because obviously, as you say, I mean, there was a couple of these job descriptions that went viral this week. And when you think about just the amount of importance they obviously place on these roles, as you say, kind of making more than your average junior doctor, you think something very strange is going on here. You also think something very strange is going on here when you think about how diverse the health service is. The health service medical staff, I think I'm right in saying, is about 50% white, whereas the country is about 86% white.
Yeah.
Asian people in particular are overrepresented fourfold, I think, as opposed to the population. And so what are these diversity managers there to do, really? Yeah. I mean, and you suspect that part of this is just about the general kind of ideology of diversity, which is very much about managing workplace relations in this quite ugly way, the idea that you've got basic irreconcilable communities who need to be constantly tutored through their engagement with one another in some way, shape or form. It's not about driving up the actual diversity because it's an incredibly diverse sort of place.
Yeah.
And so not only, as you say, it just shows that even in an institution which has a very practical point to it, it's there to look after people, it's there to provide healthcare. Even there, these other kind of political concerns, and this is political at the end of the day, start to seep into it. So even if this can happen in the National Health Service, it shouldn't be a surprise that it's taken over practically every other institution in the country, I guess.
And we've seen, a lot of the woke politics creep into the NHS, and presumably this is the work of these diversity managers. I mean, earlier this year, a leaked A to Z glossary of diversity, equality and inclusion terms was made available to the public, accidentally, I suppose, and now it's private, talking about things like white privilege, talking about intersectionality, talking about transitioning, all that kind of stuff. I mean, Ella, what do you make of this? I mean, supposedly the NHS is meant to be rational and following science and, in order to give people the best healthcare.
Well, I think it's incredibly insulting to staff. I mean, this is, for me, first and foremost, really a workers' issue, in that the suggestion of having these diversity officers or, people on oversight boards is to police what staff are doing and police their interactions with their patients. And any overworked nurse or doctor or cleaner or, anyone, administrator in the NHS knows that when they are dealing with patients, it's one of the most personal things you can do. And unless you meet the odd kind of arsehole, most people working in the NHS are angels and they will do anything to accommodate you. And anyone who's been to hospital recently knows that even during the worst periods for the NHS throughout the pandemic, people are there, they care. That's their whole role. And so they're not going to call you the N-word. They're not going to misgender you on purpose. All these things that are now sort of at the forefront of these kind of diversity schemes' attention, staff are already doing and have been doing for many, many years. I mean, you also made the point in your article this week, Fraser, that, the eye-watering sums that they're on, was it 75,000
75 grand a year.
I mean, I don't want to make the penny pinching any NHS argument because it's boring and it sort of often misses the point. But on the radio this morning, you had one of the CEOs of NHS providers who's kind of in charge of these trusts coming on and begging the Chancellor, saying, unless you give the NHS more money, unless the government funds us, people will die from not getting care. And so that there's cognitive dissonance there between paying extortionate sums to people who do sod all, really, other than, tell people what to say and what not to say.
Welfare for the middle classes,
and then you have nurses and doctors and cleaners and all the staff who actually deal with making people better and keeping the place clean and sanitized and safe are on pittances. So it's really quite sickening in that regard.
And the NHS is not the only example, obviously, of this kind of, institutions going into woke overdrive, but also it's not the only example of an institution that feels the need to become more diverse, even though it is already diverse, or perhaps even more diverse than the country itself. I mean, the BBC is in a similar position. It's a similar thing going on in the advertising industry, in the TV industry as a whole. The Bank of England is explicitly setting diversity targets that are higher than the population as a whole. I mean, what does this tell us? I mean, does it just say this urge cannot be satisfied, that there's no level of diversity that's ever enough?
Well, I think it shows as well that it's not really about diversity as the kind of lived experience of that in a workplace and society, or whatever else. It's about the politics that's become attached to it, really. As you say, there's the quotas thing. There's a part of this which just becomes sort of virtue signaling. I mean, even a quota that was bang on the percentage of the population would be a quite weird sort of racial bean counting thing to do. You know, if there are obvious barriers that need to be addressed, they should be taken down. But at the same time, the idea that you're going to get perfect representation in all spheres of life is ridiculous and can lead to some quite patronising and divisive policies to try and correct that. But again, there's more to this, as we know. It's about pushing a kind of identity politics. It's about pushing a form of racial etiquette in many instances. It's about communicating the right quote unquote values. And as much as we might blanch at it when you see it happening in the health service, even the fact that pretty much any arts institution you could think of is basically paid up to this stuff is weird. Like, why would all of them basically speak with one voice on issues of identity and all the rest of it? So the unanimity of thinking amongst all these institutions is quite striking. And I think that's what this is about, really. The quotas and stuff, that's just kind of virtue signaling by the sidelines, but really what it's about is the domination of this kind of politics and the way in which it's seamlessly just been able to take over all these kinds of institutions almost overnight, it feels like.